Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. If any of you did your Office of Readings today, and even if you didn't, don't worry about it. I do want to ask if you could look it up at the very least. The second reading from the Office of Readings today. The church places before us a sermon from St. Augustine. That sermon comes out with hard punches. I mean, he comes out swinging. He dismantles every single illusion that our faith draws us to earthly comfort. And believe me, I know, very personally, I know that it can be alarming for us to see how certain Christians live a particular brand of the faith and they seem to be well off or popular or they're famous or they have influence or whatever it might be, or they live pleasurable lives. You can go through any of these categories. I understand that. But I need you to know that if we look at the wisdom of the fathers that have gone before us, those great saints of the faith, well, Augustine makes it very clear. And he's reflecting upon Jesus' words in Matthew 24:13. He who perseveres to the end will be saved. Every sentence he writes today is to remind us that salvation will be for those who remain faithful, not just for those who seem to be blessed in the eyes of the world. And I think that's a really crucial reminder, because the gospel text that Augustine quotes from comes from what we call the Olivet Discourse. Now, in the Olivet Discourse, this is particularly Matthew 24, Jesus sits upon the Mount of Olives. This is east of Jerusalem. From the Mount of Olives, he's able to look directly across the Kidron Valley to the Temple Mount, essentially Mount Zion, Mount Jerusalem. That geographical setting is crucial. The temple that Jesus is most probably looking at while he's giving this discourse represented a kind of liturgical permanence in the Jewish mind. Jesus is foretelling its destruction, but the disciples are also being taught here that every earthly blessing and structure will pass away. It's only God's covenant that will remain forever. Augustine will draw from that same lesson, and the reason why is because as Christians, it can be tempting for us to want to seek permanence in blessings or permanence in a blessed state of life. This too shall pass, my friends. Every good season we have, we all know too well, this too shall pass. But that also means every suffering season we have, this too shall pass. The Greek verb that's translated as perseveres, Matthew uses the word hupomeno, but when it's transliterated, we get the word hyper from the prefix. So hypomeno, the word means more than just a kind of passive endurance. It's steadfastly remaining beneath the faithful resolve that you've chosen, which simply means this. If you and I choose to hupomeno, to meno means to remain, and hupo means excessively remain. So to persevere in this regard, according to Jesus' words, is to simply say, God, even in the worst of this, I am going to excessively choose to be faithful to the commitment I made to you, because I trust that you are faithful to the commitment you made to me. It's sort of the same word, or at least it shares the same root, with Jesus' command to have his disciples abide in him. Augustine then begins with this language of affliction. He writes, whenever we suffer some affliction, we should regard it both as punishment and as a correction. Now, we can recoil from that language, and I understand this, because we have a brand of Christianity today that loves associating the word love and divine love with constant, uninterrupted comfort. But the reality is, if you read the scriptures, if God is a loving Father, he is divine Father, then he gives us loving discipline as evidence of his divine fatherhood. So when he allows us to suffer, when we suffer some affliction, he wants to have that as an occasion for testing, for correction, for reordering. In fact, the book of Proverbs proclaims that exact same truth. And so Augustine is inviting Christians into the Father's household, where we are corrected that we may be sanctified. And some of us might think, well, my life was going great. I didn't need to be corrected. Well, maybe that's the correction, that we need to be driven deeper into trust and love of God. God never wants any of his children to stay passive or stagnant. There's no such thing as being stationary in the spiritual life. We're either growing or we're falling backward. In the Old Testament background here, that's even further than the language of Eden, Augustine reminds us that death entered history through Adam's rebellion. And because of this, especially in the Second Temple period, Jews used to frequently reflect upon Adam's transgression as the fountainhead for all human suffering, which is true. The Wisdom of Solomon declares that through the devil's envy, death entered the world. That's Wisdom 2:24. Paul teaches that death spread through Adam toward all humanity, but the reversal is that life enters through Christ, the new Adam. So Augustine is telling us that now, because of that, even our hardship is still within the larger biblical story. And Augustine reminds us, our holy scriptures do not promise us peace, security, and rest. How I wish Augustine didn't write those words. I remember reading them earlier today, thinking, oh, you've got to be kidding me. I mean, I know this, I just didn't need to see it reminded. But Augustine goes, no, our holy scriptures themselves do not promise us peace, security, and rest. That's the entire narrative of the faithful. Jewish theology saw the wilderness of suffering as a school of formation and love in the covenant. In fact, the Hebrew word midbar, that means wilderness, the rabbinic tradition used to associate the midbar with connection and dependence to God's voice. In fact, midbar and dabar, they share the same root, and the root is the word for speech, dabar. And so, what does that mean? God allows sufferings to befall us because he knows that in those moments we will seek to cling to him stronger. I will say, though, the human nature can be very stubborn. The will that has chosen self-sufficiency needs to be bent and sometimes broken before it will admit, Father, I need you. I'm speaking from personal experience here. Believe me, you're not alone in this. Neither am I. In the wilderness, in the worst of our sufferings, in our spiraling in depression and anxiety, I'm not talking about clinical depression and anxiety, but situations that cause us to be depressed and anxious, in our spiraling in worry, God wants us to make acts of the will because it is not about your emotional high. He wants us to make acts of the will to say, Father, I cling to you. In fact, the kind of murmuring that we see in the scriptures, the Hebrew verb lun, the persistent grumbling, that's against God's providence. God wants us to cry out to him. He doesn't want us to criticize against him. And so your heart is breaking. And I understand it because Augustine understands it even more. You are burdened beneath a weight that feels unbearable day in, day out. And interiorly and on your shoulders even, you feel almost physically the weight of the anxiety and the fear and the worry. And yet, Augustine reminds us, we weren't guaranteed peace in this life. In all of this, we need to remember that today's second reading in the Office of Readings is challenging you and I to hypomeno, to hyper-abide in God, to excessively remain in God's trust. Which means that we look at our sufferings in the face and profess in our hearts that my Father is greater than this. And then to very willingly say, I will press forward in an excessive trust that my Father will come through. Because he will. He wants to be faithful to us, and he is faithful to us. So my friends, as your brother, I urge you, trust him because he cares for you. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.